A derailment left dozens missing, but a family of squatters nearby feasted well that winter. In 1875, the Kansas countryside became the site of one of the most terrifying stories you've never heard: the railroad cannibals of Black Hollow. When a train carrying dozens of passengers derailed, the survivors found themselves stranded in a place far worse than they could have imagined. Black Hollow, a cursed stretch of land, didn't just claim the lives of the dead, it turned the living into monsters. The squatters who lived there weren't just struggling to survive. They were feasting on the flesh of the fallen, and what followed was a nightmare that no one could escape. The train was speeding through the endless Kansas plains, its wheels screeching against the metal tracks. It was a cold winter day, the air thick with the biting chill that seemed to creep into the bones. Inside, the passengers were a mixture of weary soul prisoners bound for a distant penitentiary, a few innocent travelers, and a handful of unlucky souls who had just found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. The low murmur of conversation filled the cabin, but it didn't last long. There was a strange feeling in the air, as if something was watching, waiting. And then, the train hit Black Hollow. The moment the engine crossed into the cursed stretch of land, something changed. The train's rhythmic motion was interrupted by a strange, unnatural groan, a sound that seemed to come, not from the wheels or the tracks, but from the very earth beneath them. A cold wind rushed through the train, rattling the windows, and a sense of dread swept over the passengers. They could feel it in their bones. This wasn't just a train ride, it was a journey into hell. Suddenly, the train lurched violently to the side, the sharp screech of metal scraping against metal deafening the air. Panic set in as the passengers screamed, clutching at anything they could for support. The ground beneath them seemed to twist, the very tracks warping as if they were alive. The train was no longer in control. It was at the mercy of the land, and the land had no mercy. The engine first buckled, twisting like a giant's toy, then tore free from the rest of the train. The cars behind it slammed into each other with horrific force, the sound of splintering wood and snapping metal ripping through the air. The wreckage sent shards of glass, splinters of wood, and chunks of iron flying in all directions. Some passengers were thrown from their seats, others pinned under debris, while the more fortunate ones were simply left to stumble in shock, disoriented and covered in dust. But in the madness of the crash, a single figure stood, out and ex-lawman turned convict, a man named Thomas Clay. He had been traveling with the rest of the prisoners, his hands shackled, but it wasn't his chains that held him down now. It was the crushing weight of the wreckage and the rising panic that crawled under his skin. He managed to break free from his restraints, crawling through the twisted metal and smoke, gasping for air. The land outside felt wrong, the air thick with an unnatural fog that clung to everything, even the trees. As Clay stumbled through the wreckage, his heart raced. The air smelled of burning wood and something else, something foul, something old. The wind seemed to whisper, a voice that only he could hear. Run, it seemed to say. Run before it's too late. As the train's smoke billowed into the gray sky, the survivors began to emerge from the wreckage, dazed and confused. Some were calling out for help, others stumbling in shock, their bodies bruised and battered. But when they looked around, it was clear they were not in a familiar place. They were deep within the hollow, far from any known town, surrounded by twisted trees and an eerie silence. The wreck had scattered them across a landscape that felt alive, watching them with hungry eyes. At first, the survivors tried to gather their bearings. They began to call out to each other, piecing together who was missing, who had died. But no one was coming. There were no rescuers on the horizon, no distant lights. The wind howled, and as it passed through the barren trees, it seemed to carry with it whispers. Or were they voices? They couldn't be sure. Thomas Clay had been a man of few words, but he wasn't a fool. The wreck was no accident. Something had happened to the train, something deliberate. The way the land had twisted beneath them, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the work of something far more sinister than faulty tracks. And now, they were trapped. "Where the hell are we?" someone shouted from the wreckage. A man in a torn coat, bleeding from his side, looked out into the eerie wilderness that surrounded them. The fog swirled unnaturally, and the wind carried an ominous chill. This isn't Kansas. This is something else. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the distance, through the mist, something else caught Clay's eye, a figure. A person. No, something wrong. It was a shadow, moving with a grace that felt unnatural. The shape shifted, its form barely discernible, before it vanished into the trees. Clay felt his pulse quicken. They weren't alone. He stumbled forward, his legs unsteady, his mind racing. The land was alive, alive with a malevolent presence. His thoughts turned back to the wreck. Had this been the land's doing? Or had someone set the train up for this? Something didn't sit right. He'd heard the whispers, the stories of Black Hollow before the rumors of a cursed land that claimed the souls of those foolish enough to pass through it. It was supposed to be just folklore, nothing more than ghost stories told around campfires. But as he looked around, something told him that the stories were far from fiction. A loud crash interrupted his thoughts. Another figure had appeared, stumbling through the wreckage. A woman, her clothes torn, her face pale with terror. She was holding something in her hands. Was it a child? No, it was. Too small, too still. She was shaking, her eyes wide with panic. "They're coming," she whispered, barely audible over the wind. "We need to leave. Now." Clay barely had time to react before the ground beneath them rumbled. The distant sound of metal scraping against metal. The train echoed through the hollow. But it wasn't just a train. The sound was followed by something worse, something that made his blood run cold. It was the unmistakable screech of a train whistling, a ghostly wail that carried across the land, sending shivers through his spine. That was when they heard it. The unmistakable screams of people, screams that sounded like they were coming from the wrecked cars. But it wasn't just the survivors. No, it was something else, something wrong. Clay spun around to face the wreckage, but when he did, the sight that met him was worse than any nightmare. In the shadows of the wreck, something was moving. Figures emerged from the dark, but they weren't human, at least not entirely. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their bodies twisted unnaturally, as if they were mere shadows of what they had once been. Clay's heart pounded in his chest. The land wasn't just cursed, it was hungry. And these things, they were part of it. The Hollow had claimed them, just as it would claim anyone who dared to enter its domain. As the figures closed in on them, their twisted faces grinning with hunger, Clay realized the truth. The Hollow was not just a place, it was a death trap, and they were the next victims. But this wasn't the end of their nightmare. It was only just beginning. As the survivors faced the horrors lurking in the shadows, they'd soon learn that the land itself was more than just a trap. It was alive, and it was hunting them. As the survivors stumbled away from the wreckage, the fog thickened, smothering the land in a cloak of suffocating darkness. The air was thick with dread, and every crackle of the dry brush felt like the whisper of something watching. The wind howled through the barren trees, and every gust sent a shiver through the survivors' bodies. They were no longer just escaping a train wreck, they were running for their lives. Clara, one of the survivors, could barely catch her breath. Her legs ached from running, and her mind raced. What had they stumbled into? The land felt wrong, like it was a live predator waiting to strike. She turned back, her eyes scanning the dark horizon, but saw nothing. Just the thickening fog and the twisted trees of Black Hollow. "Where are we going?" someone asked from behind her. It was a man. His name was Daniel, and he was one of the convicts who had been on the train. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. Clara didn't know the answer. She was barely keeping it together herself, but she knew one thing: they couldn't keep wandering aimlessly through the cursed land. There had to be shelter somewhere. They couldn't survive in the open like this, not with whatever horrors were hunting them. Then, through the haze of fear, they saw it. A small shack, nestled deep within the hollow, half hidden by the twisted trees and the creeping fog. The survivors exchanged nervous glances. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was their only chance for refuge. Without saying a word, they began to move toward it. Each step felt like a small victory against the crushing weight of fear. But as they neared the shack, a sense of unease grew in the pit of Clara's stomach. There was something off about this place. The way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, the way the door to the shack stood slightly ajar, inviting them inside. It wasn't just abandoned net, it was waiting. As they entered the shack, the air grew colder. It was an old structure, built from rotting wood, with no windows and a thick layer of dust on every surface. The inside was sparsely furnished, with a lone fireplace in the corner that had long since gone cold. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the entire place felt as if it hadn't been touched in years. But the most unsettling thing about the shack was its inhabitants. A family of squatters, sitting around a dim fire, turned their eyes toward the newcomers without a word. There were 5 of them: a grizzled man with a weathered face, a woman whose eyes seemed hollow, and 3 children, 2 boys and a girl who looked strangely feral. The moment their eyes locked with Clara's, a chill ran down her spine. These were not ordinary people. They were survivors of something far worse than the wreck. They were part of the Hollow's curse. The patriarch of the family, Ezekiel, stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the survivors. His gaze was intense, calculating, as though he were measuring them, deciding which of them would make the best contribution to the meal. "You're lucky to have found us," Ezekiel said, his voice low and raspy. "This land, it's not kind to the lost, but we can help you. Stay the night, and tomorrow we'll get you out of here." Clara hesitated, but the exhaustion in her bones told her she had no choice. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to make her voice steady despite the cold knot of fear in her stomach. "Ezekiel," he said, stepping closer. "And this is my family." His eyes flicked to his children, who didn't blink, their gaze unwavering and unnervingly intense. The woman, who had been silent until now, spoke in a low murmur. "You'll want to stay close tonight," she said. "The Hollow gets hungry after dark." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "Hungry?" Before she could respond, Ezekiel turned toward the fire, waving his hand toward the survivors. "Sit. Get warm. The Hollow doesn't like it when you're cold." His voice was more a command than an invitation. The survivors exchanged uneasy glances, but one by one, they made their way to the fire, too tired to argue. As they settled near the flames, Ezekiel stood in the doorway, looking out into the fog. "There's not much left in this world but what you can take," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "But the Hollow, it takes more than just your body. It takes your soul. It's always hungry." Clara's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had walked straight into a trap, but there was nowhere else to go. The shack was their only refuge, at least for now. She tried to push the fear aside, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Something was very wrong with this family. Hours passed, and the fire crackled as the night grew darker. The wind outside howled through the trees, but within the shack, it was eerily still. Clara's eyes darted around the room, lingering on the family members who seemed so calm. The children were oddly silent, their eyes following every movement with unsettling intensity. The woman never once looked away from the fire, her lips twitching into a thin, knowing smile. Clara tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but the hunger gnawing at her stomach was unbearable. She hadn't eaten since the wreck, and the others were in the same condition. "Ezekiel," Clara spoke up, her voice strained. "Do you have any food? Anything?" Ezekiel turned slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. He smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Food, you say? Well, there's always enough to share around here. But you will have to prove yourself first." Clara's heart dropped. What did he mean by that? The other survivors shifted uneasily, but none spoke up. It was then that Clara realized something truly horrifying. Ezekiel wasn't just a man, he was part of the land itself, tied to its dark. Hunger, and the others were no better. They were all trapped here, just like the passengers of the wreck. Without warning, the woman rose to her feet. She moved with unnatural grace, her gaze never leaving Clara. "There's always room for one more," she said, her voice like a soft melody. "The Hollow always makes room." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't just being welcomed into their home, she was being hunted. The Hollow was no mere land, it was a curse, and the squatters were its servants, feeding it with the flesh of the innocent. Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind them. The survivors would soon realize that the true horror of Black Hollow was not just the land itself, but the monstrous family that lived there. And when hunger meets desperation, the stakes would rise higher than they could ever imagine. The night dragged on, but Clara couldn't sleep. The shadows in the corners of the shack seemed to move, curling and shifting like living things. The fire crackled weakly, casting long twisted shadows on the walls. The air felt heavy pressing down on her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She tossed and turned on the rough floor, trying to shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every sound from outside made her tense. It wasn't the wind, it was something else, something far more sinister. Clara tried to focus on the fire, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Ezekiel and his strange family. They weren't just survivors. They weren't just people trying to make it through the day. They were something else, something wrong. The Hollow had changed them. She could feel it. The shack was still, save for the occasional crack of wood from the fire. But Clara's mind raced. She had to find out more about the land, about the curse, about what was really happening here. But when she looked around the room, Ezekiel and his family were all silent, staring into the fire with hollow expressions. Then, a voice cut through the silence. It was Daniel, the convict who had been on the train with her. He had been quiet most of the night, but now his voice trembled as he whispered, "What is this place? Why are we here? It's not just an accident, is it?" Clara turned toward him, her heart sinking. The fear in his eyes mirrored her own. "No," she whispered back. "It's not an accident. There's something in this land, something alive." Before Daniel could respond, the door to the shack creaked open. Ezekiel stood there, framed by the eerie light of the moon. He looked at them, his face expressionless. Then, without a word, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "We have to move," Ezekiel said, his voice calm but laced with something darker. "The hollow won't wait forever." Clara's stomach twisted. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" Ezekiel didn't answer. He simply turned, gesturing for them to follow. "You'll understand soon enough." The survivors had no choice but to obey. There was nowhere else to go, and with every passing second, the hollow seemed to tighten its grip around them. They followed Ezekiel out of the shack, the cold night air biting at their skin. The fog had grown thicker, wrapping the land in an oppressive blanket of white. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees like black, gnarled fingers reaching out from the darkness. "We have to leave," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "This isn't right. We have to get out of here before it's too late." Clara nodded in agreement, but Ezekiel's gaze was unwavering. "You'll learn soon enough that you can't just leave Black Hollow. It doesn't let you go. Once you've crossed its line, you belong to it. The land takes you." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Clara truly understood the depth of the danger they were in. They weren't just trapped here by a train wreck. No, the hollow had claimed them, and its hunger had no end. They walked in silence, the sounds of their footsteps the only noise that broke the stillness. Every now and then, Clara thought she saw movement in the fog figures moving in the distance, too fast to make out. She shook her head, trying to clear her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the land was alive, watching them with hungry eyes. Finally, they reached the edge of the hollow, a small clearing in the forest where the fog seemed to thin, just enough to let the moonlight break through. And that's when she saw it. The railroad tracks, the twisted, rusted metal stretched out across the clearing, vanishing into the fog. It was as if the tracks had always been there, hidden by the hollow until now. The train's presence hung in the air like a sickening memory, the ghostly whistle of a train that had never really left. "This is where it all began," Ezekiel said, his voice low. He walked toward the tracks, his eyes focused on the metal rails. "The land feeds on death. It feeds on the ones who get too close, the ones who think they can escape. But you can't escape Black Hollow. The train doesn't just carry passengers, it carries their souls, and once you're here, you're part of the land forever." Clara's heart sank. The tracks that train, they were more than just an accident. They were a trap. Black Hollow didn't just kill. It captured, trapping souls in a never-ending cycle of torment. "Ezekiel, you're talking about ghosts," Daniel said, his voice filled with disbelief. "This is insane. The train wreck was just an accident. There's no curse." Ezekiel turned sharply, his eyes cold. "It's not just an accident. The land chooses, and it chooses who it wants." The tension thickened, and Clara felt the weight of his words settle over her. She wanted to believe that it was all just superstition, but the hollow was more than that. The land had claimed the wreck, and now it was claiming them. And then came the whistle. The sound was distant at first, almost inaudible, but then it grew louder, the screech of metal on metal, the agonized moan of a train that shouldn't be there. The ghostly whistle seemed to pierce the air, and Clara's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a dream or hallucination. The train was real, and it was coming for them. The fog parted briefly, just enough to reveal a sight that would haunt Clara for the rest of her life. The train still intact, still whole, was barreling down the tracks toward them, its lights flickering like dying stars. But it wasn't just a train. The passengers inside were not alive. Their faces were twisted in agony, their bodies contorted, and they pressed against the windows as if they were trying to reach out to claim them. The train's headlights blazed through the fog, casting long shadows over the land. The whistle grew deafening, but it wasn't a sound of arrival, it was a sound of doom. The train was not there to transport anyone. It was there to consume. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat as the train came closer, its metallic screech scraping against her ears. The hollow was not just cursed by death, it was cursed by something far darker, something that could never be destroyed. The train stopped just a few feet away from them, the ghostly passengers staring through the windows, their eyes empty, their mouths open in silent screams. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them began to tremble, the fog thickening once again, and the train vanished as though it had never been there at all. But Clara knew one thing for sure: the hollow had claimed them, and it would never let them go. The survivors, now fully aware of the curse, must confront the horrors of Black Hollow, no longer just haunted by the train, but haunted by the very land itself. What will they sacrifice to survive the hunger of the hollow? The night felt endless. The survivors huddled together near the shack, the fire's flames flickering weakly in the oppressive darkness. Clara's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the image of the ghostly train, the passengers pressing their twisted faces against the glass, the cold screech of the wheels grinding through her skull. It felt like they were trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Ezekiel and his family watched them in silence, as if they were all waiting for something. The air between them felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension. The children, who had once appeared almost feral, were now eerily calm. Their eyes never left the survivors, and Clara couldn't help but feel like they were calculating something, like they were waiting for the right moment to pounce. She tried to push the thought away, but it kept creeping back. This place was not normal, and neither were the squatters. The woman of the family, whose name Clara had never learned, stirred the fire with a long stick, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes flickered to Clara, and for a brief moment, a sickening smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "You're hungry," the woman said in a voice so calm it sent a shiver down Clara's spine. "The hollow always makes room for hunger." Clara's stomach clenched at the woman's words. She hadn't realized how hungry she truly was until now. The wreck had taken everything from them: food, water, hope. It had only been hours since the crash, but it felt like days. She hadn't eaten since the train derailed, and the pit in her stomach grew deeper with every passing minute. "We're not that hungry," Daniel spoke up, his voice shaking but defiant. "We just need to get out of here." Ezekiel's cold gaze swept over him, and the air seemed to freeze. "You'll learn soon enough," he said, his tone clipped. "The hollow doesn't care about your plans. The hollow only cares about what it can take." Clara's eyes darted around the group. She could feel the oppressive weight of the land pressing down on them, suffocating them. She had thought the wreck was the worst of it, but now she wasn't so sure. The woman Ezekiel's wife, Clara realized, rose and walked toward the shack's small kitchen area, her footsteps eerily quiet on the wooden floor. She grabbed a large pot and set it on the fire, the contents hidden from view. Clara's mind raced. She had to stay calm, stay in control. But as the woman stirred the pot, the smell of cooking meat filled the air. It wasn't just hunger anymore. The scent was something darker, something primal. Clara's heart skipped a beat, and she fought to keep her stomach from lurching. She had seen enough to know that something was wrong, but what could they do? They were trapped, and the land itself seemed to be closing in on them. The woman turned back. To them, a soft smile on her lips. "Come," she said, "eat." Without another word, the squatters sat down around the fire, waiting. The children didn't speak, only watched, their eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. Clara hesitated. The smell of the meat was too much, too tempting, and her body ached for food. But she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. The hollow was feeding on them, not just with food, but with something far darker. Daniel was the first to speak. "What is that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What are you feeding us?" The woman's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with something unsettling. "It's just what the land provides. Nothing goes to waste here." The words sent a chill down Clara's spine. She watched as the woman ladled the steaming meat into a bowl, offering it to the survivors. Her hands were steady, unshaken by the fear that had gripped the others. The land, the hollow, it had already claimed them. Clara's gaze flicked to Ezekiel, who was watching them closely. His face was unreadable, but there was something pleased in his eyes, something hungry. It wasn't just the hollow that had claimed them, it was him. This was a game to him, and the survivors were the prey. She couldn't take it anymore. The hunger, the fear, the closeness of it all. She had to know the truth. "What's in the pot?" Clara demanded, standing up suddenly. "What really is that meat?" Ezekiel's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed. The woman's smile faded, replaced by an unsettling calm. "You don't want to know," she said softly, but it was too late. Clara's eyes locked onto the meat in the bowl, and it hit her like a slap across the face. The texture wasn't quite right. It was too soft, too moist. The color was off too. And then it clicked. The smell, the taste. It wasn't just wild game. It was human. Her stomach churned, the realization sinking like a stone in her gut. Clara staggered back, almost knocking over the fire. "You." She couldn't finish the sentence. The horror of it all was too much to process. Ezekiel finally spoke. "The hollow doesn't let things go to waste. You'll learn to survive the way we have be feeding it." His voice was cold, final. "Once you're here, it owns you. All of you." The survivors stared at the meat, their faces pale with shock and disgust. Some of them had already begun eating, but now they stopped, their eyes widening as they realized the same truth. They had been eating flesh, human flesh. Clara felt like she was going to be sick, but the hunger gnawing at her was too strong. She couldn't deny it anymore. Her body was screaming for sustenance, and the hollow had fed them. Ezekiel's eyes gleamed with twisted satisfaction. You'll get used to it. The hollow always makes room for those who understand its hunger. But Clara wasn't listening. The hollow, the train, the curse, they were all connected. It was all part of the same nightmare, the same hunger. She realized then that she wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for her soul. The survivors would soon learn that Black Hollow didn't just consume their bodies, it consumed their very humanity. As they tried to break free from the hollow's grasp, they discovered that no one escaped without paying the price, and the price would be far higher than they could ever imagine. The fire was dying. Only smoldering embers remained, casting faint glows over the survivors' ashen faces. The shack felt smaller now, suffocating. The wind outside howled through the trees, but inside, the air was thick with dread. The survivors sat in a tense silence, the realization of what they had consumed still gnawing at their minds. The hollow had claimed them body and soul, and they couldn't escape. Clara's stomach twisted as she wiped her mouth, her appetite gone, replaced by a cold, hollow feeling. She couldn't forget what they had eaten, what they had to eat to survive. But it wasn't just the food. It was the curse. The land itself was alive, breathing, watching them. Every minute they stayed in Black Hollow, the land grew stronger, feeding off their fear, their terror. Ezekiel stood by the door, his posture stiff and still. His eyes gleamed in the dim light as he watched them, waiting for their reactions. The hollow doesn't give freely, he said softly, almost as if to himself. You think you've eaten. You think you've survived. But the hollow gives and it takes. Clara shuddered. What do you mean? The hollow is a living thing, Ezekiel replied, his voice low and eerily calm. It feeds on fear, on death, on life. It doesn't just consume flesh. It consumes you. You won't feel it at first, but eventually, it will take what's inside, your soul. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Clara couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The hollow was alive, and now it was inside them. I've seen it happen before, Ezekiel continued, his gaze never leaving Clara. They come in looking for salvation, but they leave changed if they leave at all. Clara turned away, her hands trembling. Daniel was the first to speak. What are you saying? Are we cursed? Ezekiel didn't answer immediately. He simply stared into the dying fire. The curse is a slow one. It feeds off the ones who think they can escape. It starts small, a whisper here, a shadow there. But eventually, it takes hold. It doesn't let you go. No one escapes Black Hollow. Clara's mind raced. The train to wreck, the ghosts say, weren't just random occurrences. They were part of something bigger, something that had been here long before them. The hollow wasn't just a place, it was a force, and they were at its mercy. A noise broke her thoughts, the faintest sound, like footsteps in the dirt outside. The wind had died down, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. The hairs on the back of Clara's neck stood up as she looked toward the door. Something was out there. She could feel it. Do you hear that? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The others stiffened, their eyes wide with sudden terror. Then, the door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, a shadow against the dim light of the fire. It was a man, but something about him was wrong. His clothes were torn, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. His body was bent unnaturally, like it was held together by strings that were about to snap. It wasn't a man anymore. Clara gasped, stumbling back as the others recoiled in horror. The figure didn't move, just stood there in the doorway, staring at them with an unblinking gaze. Who is that? Daniel choked, his voice trembling. Ezekiel stood silently, his expression unchanged. That is what the hollow does to you. That is what it takes. The figure suddenly lurched forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the air grew colder. It wasn't a levee, it was a shadow, a remnant, a twisted fragment of the land itself, a ghost of the hollow's hunger. The figure stepped closer, its breath ragged and wet. It reached out toward them, its fingers elongated, like claws, scraping against the doorframe. Clara felt a cold chill seep into her bones, the air thick with a sense of doom. But before it could move any closer, Ezekiel raised his hand. Enough, he said, his voice sharp and commanding. It's not time for you yet. The figure stopped, its eyes flicking toward Ezekiel, as if obeying some unseen command. It backed away slowly, its gaze lingering on the survivors before disappearing into the shadows. Clara's breath came in. Short, panicked gasps. What was that? What is that? Ezekiel turned to face her, his eyes still cold and distant. That is what happens when the hollow claims you. You become a part of it, a piece of its hunger. It's not just the body it consumes, it's everything, and eventually, it takes you. Clara's chest tightened. She had no idea how to respond. Every step they took in Black Hollow only seemed to push them deeper into its grip. They weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting to hold on to what little of themselves remained. And yet, in the silence that followed, another terrifying truth settled in her mind. They weren't just surviving. They were becoming part of the curse. The door slammed shut behind them, and the sound of the wind returned, but it felt different now, more alive, more hungry. Clara could feel the land moving beneath her, the ground shifting, as if it were watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. There was no escape, and then the ground beneath their feet shook. It started as a low rumble, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The shack creaked and groaned as the floorboards began to tremble. The survivors looked around in panic. "What is happening?" Daniel shouted, trying to hold his ground. "The Hollow wants something," Ezekiel said softly, stepping away from the fire. "It's coming for you." Before Clara could ask what that meant, the sound of a distant train whistle echoed through the fog. The ground shook violently, and a deep, guttural scream filled the air. It wasn't just a whistle, it was a warning. And Clara knew with terrifying certainty that the Hollow wasn't done with them yet. They had only just begun to understand the price of their survival. The survivors had no idea just how deep the Hollow's grip ran. They were no longer just victims, they were pawns in a game they didn't understand, and the Hollow was playing with them. The next step in their nightmare was about to unfold, and the land would not let them leave until it had consumed everything. The earth trembled beneath Clara's feet, the ground shifting like the Hollow itself was waking from some deep, restless slumber. The distant train whistle, eerie and unnatural, echoed through the fog, sending chills through her bones. The survivors stood frozen, their hearts pounding as the sounds of the Hollow grew louder, more insistent. The train was near, but it wasn't coming to save them. It was coming to claim them. "What is happening?" Daniel gasped, his voice trembling as he backed away from the door. The fire flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The wind howled outside, but it felt like it was howling at them. Ezekiel didn't respond at first. His eyes were fixed on the dark horizon, his posture stiff, as if he were listening for something, waiting for it to arrive. Finally, he turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "It's begun," he said quietly, almost too quietly. "The hunt has started." Clara's stomach twisted in a knot. She didn't need him to explain. She could feel the growing sense of being watched. The land wasn't just watching them now, it was hunting them. And it wasn't just the Hollow that had an appetite. It was the family, the squatters, who had already made their claim. The door to the shack swung open, creaking loudly in the stillness. Ezekiel stepped forward, his eyes scanning the fog like a predator on the prowl. "You've been marked," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Hollow has chosen you. Now, it's time to pay the price." Clara's heart stopped. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. It felt like the world had gone silent, the only sound now the beating of her heart in her ears. She looked around at the other survivors, Daniel, the woman named Clara, and the other Sands saw the same terror reflected in their faces. This wasn't a simple fight for survival. This was a hunt. "What are you talking about?" Daniel demanded, his voice rising. "You've been feeding us to the Hollow all along. You've been using us, sacrificing us. What do you want from us?" Ezekiel turned, his eyes cold and implacable. "It's not me you should be worried about. It's the land. It's the curse that feeds on your fear. And now, it's time to hunt." With a sudden, terrifying speed, Ezekiel bolted out the door, vanishing into the fog. The survivors stood there for a moment, frozen in disbelief, until the reality of his words sank in. The hunt had begun, and they were the prey. Clara's mind raced. She wanted to run, but where could they go? The land was alive, and the Hollow's grip was closing in on them. It wasn't just the squatter sit, it was the land itself. Every tree, every twisted root, every breath of wind felt like a hand reaching for them, pulling them deeper into the Hollow's jaws. "We need to get out of here," Daniel muttered, his eyes wild with panic. Now. But Clara knew that running wouldn't help. She had seen what happened to those who tried to escape the Hollow, those who wandered too far, who thought they could outrun it. They disappeared, consumed by the land's hunger, lost forever in the fog. And then the ground shook again. This time, it wasn't just the earth. It was the Hollow itself, pulsing with dark energy. The trees around them groaned, their twisted branches reaching out like claws, and the fog thickened, wrapping the survivors in its suffocating embrace. Clara felt a surge of panic, but she didn't have time to think. She turned and ran, the others following her, their footsteps heavy in the thickening fog. The air grew colder with each step, and she could feel the land's presence pressing against her chest, tightening like a vice. They didn't get far. A shape appeared in the distance, just barely visible through the fog. It was a figure standing motionless at the edge of the clearing. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was Ezekiel or something that looked like him. He wasn't alone. A group of squatters twisted, hungry versions of the family they had meat-merged from the shadows, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they were no longer entirely human. Clara stumbled back, her heart racing. "What the hell are they?" she whispered. "They are what happens when the hollow claims you," Ezekiel's voice echoed from the fog. "What happens when you give in to the hunger?" The survivors backed away, but the figures closed in on them. The fog thickened, the shadows stretching, and Clara could feel the hollow's hunger rising in the air. It wasn't just the squatters anymore. The land itself was closing in around them, and it had no intention of letting them leave. Daniel screamed as one of the figures lunged toward him, its hands outstretched, its face twisted in a grotesque snarl. The survivors fought back, using what they could: sticks, rocks, anything they could grab. But it was futile. The land was stronger than they were. The hollow had them now. In the chaos, Clara broke free from the group, her legs moving instinctively. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away from them, away from the hollow. She ran through the fog, the sound of footsteps pounding behind her, the growl of something far darker than any human chasing her. The hollow wasn't just claiming their bodies, it was claiming their souls, twisting them into something less than human, something driven by the hunger of the land. And as she ran, Clara realized the terrible truth. The hollow didn't just want them, it needed them. The fog parted, briefly, and Clara saw something that froze her in Placia train. But it wasn't just any train. It was the ghostly locomotive from before, the same one that had arrived after the wreck, the same one that had claimed them. It was waiting for her, its headlights flickering, the passengers inside pressing their twisted faces against the windows. But they weren't passengers. They were the hollow's victim, soul after soul, trapped inside the train, their faces contorted in eternal agony. And then Clara saw the figures standing in front of the train. It was Ezekiel. His eyes gleamed with a twisted satisfaction as the train screeched to a halt. The figure raised his hand, and Clara felt the overwhelming pull of the hollow. She wasn't going to survive this. No one would. But as the train's doors opened, a voice, deep and hollow, echoed in her mind. The survivors are caught in a desperate race for survival, with the hollow closing in around them. But escape may come at a price that no one is ready to pay. What will they lose before they finally break free? The train's whistle pierced the fog like a banshee's wail, cutting through the stillness of Black Hollow. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, her legs moving instinctively, carrying her deeper into the suffocating mist. The world around her closed in, and all she could hear was the relentless screech of the train, getting louder, drawing her in. She dared not look back. The hollow wasn't just a place, it was alive, a living, breathing entity that had claimed them as prey. And now the train, with its ghostly passengers and insatiable hunger, was closing in. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but fear pushed her forward. The fog parted, just enough for her to glimpse the train's gleaming lights cutting through the mist. The locomotive moved faster than any train should, its headlights like malevolent eyes, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. She turned to run, but the train was right there, too close, too fast. And then she saw them, the passengers. But they weren't passengers. They were dead faces pressed against the windows, their eyes hollow, bodies contorted in grotesque forms. The train wasn't just transporting souls, it was a prison for them, carrying the lost and the damned. But it wasn't just the passengers that haunted Clara. It was the hunger emanating from the train, a gnawing emptiness that grew stronger with every passing second. The hollow was alive, and it was hungry for them. The train's whistle screamed again, deafening in its intensity. Clara collapsed to the ground, the earth trembling beneath her. She could feel the hollow's roots digging deep, pulling her in, claiming her. "No!" she shouted, clawing at the ground, desperate to escape. But there was no escaping it. There was no escape from the land's hunger. Then, through the fog, a figure emerged. It wasn't just any person. It was Ezekiel. His form barely visible, he stood motionless before the train, as if waiting for it. "Ezekiel," Clara screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "What are you doing?" But Ezekiel didn't answer. He didn't need to. He raised his hand and the train stopped. The screech of the wheels, grinding to a halt, sent shockwaves through the hollow, and the fog parted, revealing the train in full. Clara's breath caught as the doors of the train slowly creaked open. She wanted to run, but her legs were frozen, her mind paralyzed with terror. The train wasn't stopping for Harriet, was stopping for Ezekiel. Ezekiel stepped forward, merging with the shadows, his body dissolving into the mist. He was no longer human, had become part of the land, part of the Hollow's insatiable hunger. The train's doors swung wide, revealing the ghostly passengers, their twisted faces pressed against the windows, eyes wide with hunger. But the horror didn't end there. Ezekiel walked toward one of the passengers, a woman whose face was stretched in terror. With a brutal motion, Ezekiel tore her soul from her body, dragging it into the train's dark void. Clara's stomach churned. The Hollow didn't just consume the body, it consumed the soul. There was no escape from this curse. Ezekiel turned to Clara, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "You think you can escape? The Hollow owns you now. It owns all of us." Clara tried to move, to run, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped. The Hollow had claimed her body and soul, and now it was taking everything she had. The train's door slammed shut behind Ezekiel, and Clara's world was consumed by darkness. The sound of the wheels turning again slowly, purposefully resonated through her, as if the Hollow were toying with her, savoring the moment. But then, a faint, distant whistle broke through the fog. It wasn't from the train. It was something else, something familiar. Clara's heart skipped a beat. The whistle. It was the sound of another train, one that had been lost to the Hollow, a train that had disappeared long ago. It was the sound of those who had been forgotten. The survivors thought they had reached the end of their nightmare, but the Hollow's true power was far darker than they realized. The land was not finished with them yet, and the price they would pay for trying to escape would be higher than they could ever imagine. Clara's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The fog pressed down on her, suffocating, as the train's whistle echoed ominously. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a warning, a reminder of everything she had tried to escape. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled to stand. The Hollow was alive, consuming everything, her body, her mind, and now her soul. There was no way out. But despite the terror, a sliver of defiance remained. Clara wouldn't let the Hollow win, not without a fight. The survivors were scattered behind her, faces pale with fear. Daniel was the first to rise, eyes wide with panic. "We can't just wait here to die," he muttered, voice cracking. "We have to do something." Clara nodded, her mind racing. She had seen enough. The Hollow wasn't just a place, it was a force that fed on fear and suffering. They were the prey, the land pulling them into its depths. "We need to stop it," Clara said, her voice steady despite the terror inside. "We have to break the curse. Now." But Daniel shook his head. "How? We can't fight it. We can't outrun it." Clara's eyes hardened. "Then we make it pay." The fog seemed to tighten, the ground trembling beneath them. The Hollow was waking, growing stronger. The train, closer now, loomed like a storm on the horizon, its presence suffocating. She turned toward Ezekiel, who had been standing in the distance, his cold gaze locked on her. For a moment, his expression softened, just a flicker of something almost human. But it vanished quickly, replaced by a calm that chilled Clara to the bone. "Why are you doing this?" Clara demanded. "You've already won. Why keep tormenting us?" Ezekiel took a slow step forward. "You don't understand. The Hollow doesn't just take, it gives. It's symbiotic. It feeds, and in return, it makes us stronger. The curse isn't something to fight, it's something to embrace." Clara felt sick. "You're a monster," she spat. "No," Ezekiel replied, his lips curling into a smile. "I'm alive. This land chose me, and I chose it. You could have chosen the same, but now it's too late." The Hollow's hunger roared in the distance, and the trees around them began to shake. Clara realized with horror that the Hollow wasn't just feeding, it was summoning them, pulling them into one final feast. The train's whistle shrieked again, closer now, its doors wide open. The ghostly passengers, twisted and soulless, reached out for them. They didn't care about Ezekiel, they cared about them. Ezekiel's voice sliced through the tension. "Do you want to survive? Then you must give in. Let the Hollow take you. Let it feed." Clara's heart raced, but she refused to give in. The Hollow was stronger, yes, but there was something inside her that refused to die. She wouldn't let it take her. With a sudden burst of resolve, she turned to the survivors. "We have to stop it. Now." Without hesitation, she ran toward the tracks, the others following close behind. But as they neared the train, ground split beneath them. A deafening roar echoed as something massive began to rise from the darkness below. Clara's breath caught in her throat as a colossal, skeletal creature emerged at its body, a twisted mass of roots, metal, and broken remnants of past trains. It was the Hollow's true form, its heart, and it was coming for them all. Clara froze, terror gripping her. The creature towered over them, its eyes glowing with an unnatural fire. Then it turned toward them. Without thinking, Clara grabbed a piece of metal, trembling. She didn't know how to fight this thing, but she couldn't just stand there. She had to do something. The train's whistle screamed again, louder this time. Clara realized the creature wasn't just a form, it was the Hollow's heart. The land had birthed it, and now it was coming for them. The train was its vessel, its soul, its means of consuming everything in its path. And then it struck. The creature's massive skeletal arm shot out like a whip, knocking Clara off her feet. The impact sent her flying through the air, and everything went dark. The battle against Black Hollow had only just begun. The survivors had fought their way to the heart of the curse, but the true terror of the land was still unfolding. What price would they have to pay to destroy it? And would anyone survive the final confrontation? Clara's head throbbed as she came to, her body aching from the impact. The earth beneath her was cold, the ground cracked and uneven. She struggled to her feet, her vision blurry, but she could hear the growl of the Hollow, the shriek of the train's whistle piercing the night air. She staggered forward, her legs shaking, but the darkness surrounding her made every step feel like an eternity. The creature, the skeletal monstrosity that had risen from the heart of Black Hollow, loomed over the survivors, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fury. The fog had thickened, wrapping the land in a suffocating grip, and Clara knew that if they didn't act now, it would be too late. Behind her, she could hear Daniel and the others struggling to get up, their breathing shallow, their bodies battered. They had to find a way to stop the creature, stop the Hollow, but how? The Hollow had consumed everything in its path for centuries. There was no fighting it, no escape. But Clara wasn't ready to give up. She turned to face the creature, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It was watching her, its skeletal form towering over the wreckage of the earth, its bony hands reaching out toward them. The ground beneath it seemed to shudder with every step it took, the roots of trees twisting and snapping like they were alive. The Hollow was not just a curse, it was a force of nature, and it had come to claim them all. She couldn't let it. She couldn't let it win. "Clara!" Daniel shouted, his voice strained. He had gotten to his feet, and his face was streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes were filled with fear. "What are you doing? Get out of the way!" But Clara wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind. The Hollow couldn't be defeated with brute force. It couldn't be destroyed with weapons or violence. It was too ancient, too powerful. There was only one way to stop it. She stepped forward, her hands trembling but her resolve unwavering. She had to make the ultimate sacrifice. She had to give herself to the Hollow. "No!" Daniel cried out, but Clara didn't look back. She couldn't. She knew what she had to do. The creature was getting closer, its bone-like fingers reaching for her, its hollow eyes filled with hunger. The train screeched again, louder this time, its whistle a deafening wail that seemed to tear at Clara's very soul. The Hollow was calling her. It was calling for her to come closer, to embrace it. She didn't hesitate. The Hollow had claimed everything, her body, her mind, her soul, but it hadn't claimed her will. She reached out to the earth beneath her, her hands pressing against the cold ground. And in that moment, she felt Ida pull, a surge of dark power rising from the land itself. The Hollow's hunger answered her, its power flowing into her, consuming her. It wasn't just a curse anymore. It was her choice. Clara closed her eyes, letting the Hollow consume her. She could feel the cold embrace of the land wrap around her, its hunger coursing through her veins. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't running. She was accepting it. The ground trembled beneath her as the creature let out a guttural roar. The Hollow had been waiting for this moment for her to surrender, and now it was feeding on her, but in a way it had never done before. Clara wasn't just a victim anymore. She had become part of it. The fog swirled around her, and for a moment she thought she saw the faces of the lost souls, the passengers of the ghostly train, their eyes filled with longing, their mouths open in silent screams. They had been trapped here for eternity, bound to the Hollow, never able to escape. And now they were free, their souls, released through Clara's sacrifice, floating into the darkness. But even as she felt the Hollow's power surge through her, something unexpected happened. The train's whistle stopped. The screeching of metal faded into nothing. The earth stopped shaking. The land paused. Clara opened her eyes. The creature that had been stalking them stood frozen, its massive skeletal form motionless. The Hollow's hunger had stopped. The train, too, had come to a halt. Its ghostly passengers were still there, but their tortured faces were no longer twisted in agony. They were quiet, at peace. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She had done it. She had broken the curse, but the cost was unimaginable. The hollow had claimed her, yes, but in doing so, it had been weakened. The land's hunger had been satisfied, but at the expense of Clara's soul. She could feel it fading, slipping away as the hollow released its grip on the land. Her body remained, but her essence had been consumed, just as the others had been before her. The survivors stood in stunned silence. They had witnessed the impossible. Clara had given herself to the hollow not out of fear, but out of will, and in doing so, she had defeated it. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the clearing, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "No, this can't be," he whispered. You broke the hollow." Clara smiled weakly, her body trembling as the last of her strength faded. I did," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The hollow doesn't own us, not anymore." The creature, still standing, frozen, slowly began to dissolve into the earth, its bony form crumbling into dust. The land itself began to settle, the fog lifting, the ground returning to its original state. It was as though the curse had been broken, its power dissipating with Clara's sacrifice. The train, too, faded into the mist, its ghostly passengers now at rest, and Clara, with her final breath, knew she had done what no one else could. She had freed them, she had freed herself, but even in death, the hollow's legacy lingered. The survivors had escaped, but at what cost? The land was free, but at the cost of Clara's soul. And there was always the question, would the hollow return? The land had tasted blood, and would never forget. The fog lifted, and the survivors stood at the edge of the clearing, their faces pale and bodies battered. Clara's sacrifice had freed them from the hollow's grip, but at what cost? Her body lay still, eyes closed in peaceful surrender. Clara had given everything to break the curse. Ezekiel stood motionless, disbelief in his eyes. The hollow was gone, its hunger silenced, but a deep shadow remained. The curse might have been broken, but its legacy lingered in the air, like a dark memory. Daniel was the first to move. Kneeling beside Clara, he whispered. She stopped it, but his voice held no joy, only the weight of loss. They had survived, but at the cost of Clara's life. As Daniel stared down at her, doubt crept in. The land around them felt unnatural, as if the curse hadn't truly been lifted. Ezekiel's voice cut through the silence. "It's not over." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" She stopped it. Ezekiel shook his head. The hollow was more than just land, it was the curse itself. The land may be free, but the curse lives on in us. We must sever the tie completely, or it will never truly be gone. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "Sever the tie? What do you mean? The hollow doesn't just take, it binds. Clara freed us from its hunger, but the curse remains," Ezekiel explained. "We must destroy the heart of the hollow." Daniel's blood ran cold. "The heart of the hollow?" Ezekiel nodded, his voice low. "It's tied to the land, to the earth. We have to destroy it, or it will rise again." With a deep breath, Daniel steadied himself. "Then let's finish this, for Clara." The survivors nodded, a shared resolve settling over them. They had already lost so much, it was time to end it. Ezekiel led them deeper into the hollow. The ground trembled beneath their feet as they neared the center of the land. There, at the heart of Black Hollow, stood an ancient, twisted tree, its roots gnarled and blackened, as if corrupted by something older than the hollow itself. "This is it," Ezekiel said, "the hollow's heart, the source of the curse." The survivors circled the tree, its pulse throbbing through the ground. They could feel the land fighting to keep its hold on them. Ezekiel stepped forward, his hands raised. "We must sever the connection to the hollow. Only then will the curse be broken." He began chanting, his voice steady. The ground rumbled, but this time the shaking felt different. The hollow's power was weakening. With a final word, Ezekiel thrust his hand into the earth. There was a surge of energy, and the land trembled as the hollow's pulse slowed. The fog lifted, and the air grew still. The hollow's heart, the tree, and the curse, everything faded into nothingness. The survivors stood in stunned silence, their breaths heavy. They were free, but Clara's sacrifice would never be forgotten. Final payoff, the survivors stood in the quiet aftermath, the land around them finally at peace. The hollow was gone, but Clara's absence weighed heavily on them. She had given everything to stop the curse, and now they were free, truly free. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, Daniel glanced at the others. They had made it out. They had survived, and they owed it all to Clara. But Black Hollow's scars would remain. Though defeated, its hunger lingered like a memory. The wind whispered with the faint echo of a train whistle in the distance, a haunting reminder that its legacy would never fully fade. The survivors had won, but they would never forget the cost.